What is going on, everybody? It is another episode of the 5280 podcast right here on the MHRT network. You're probably wondering why Cameron Parker and Gage Madrid are the only two representing. Well, Mike is, getting his bread. He's earning his money, staying a little bit longer at work. Kudos to him. And Glenn, he is actually on a flight. He is actually getting ready for a flight. I want to say it's to Tulsa, and then somewhere I want to say it's in Arkansas. So you basically got the young bucks again of Cameron, myself, and Gage. So we're gonna lead it as much as we can, keep you guys informed with everything that is going on with training camp. But before we dive into any of that, Gage, how you doing, my man? You feeling better, by the way? That's probably the most important question of any training camp or anything else. You feeling better?
Feeling great, man. The leg is getting better each and every single day, getting stronger each and every single day. I appreciate all the love and support. Yeah, man, we've been out at training camp every single day. It has been a very, very awesome time out there. We've seen a lot of growth from the Broncos, and it's just a really exciting time here in the Mile High City. So I'm really excited to break it all down with you.
Reminder, everybody, that if you guys are watching the 5280 podcast over on the MHRT network page, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. But of course, if you are also watching via X or Twitter, your comments actually can be shown on on the screen. But if you would, please hit that subscribe button over there on Twitter. But nonetheless, we still am gracious and am excited to have you guys a part of the show. I think it's only fitting. I think hey, Ray, it's been a while. Hope you're well, buddy. I think it's only fitting, that we lead off with the biggest news of the day. Or I should say the last couple days or the last 24 hours. And there is really only, one thing I can really say about this, Gage, and that is crap on a cracker, man. Like, Caden Stearns is no longer a Denver Bronco. The Broncos made the curious decision of moving on from Stearns, and let's start first by I guess just diving into it on the surface. He went and joins the Panthers. He gets reunited with Ejiro Evero. It is interesting, though. I mean, he rejoins the Panthers, but it was the very first team on the waiver wire. So it kind of maybe lends you to believe that he was going to be a pretty hot commodity amongst that waiver wire for the Panthers to even consider the Evero side for them to consider, grabbing him on the waiver wire.
Yep. At the end of the day, when you just combine the back-to-back season-ending injuries along with the emergence of young safeties such as Devon Key and J.L. Skinner, Stearns became expendable. And Sean Payton pretty much had a blunt conversation with him like, look, you're just not going to fit in on our depth chart. We're going to give you an opportunity to latch on with another team early. Yes, I got to meet Eddie out at camp. That was really awesome. But anyway, they gave Stearns that opportunity to latch on with another team. They tried to trade him, but everybody knew that he was going to be put on waivers. So why give up a draft pick for him unless you really felt like you wanted to secure him? I'm going to assume the top team that was interested was Carolina, and they knew that they wouldn't have to give up a draft pick because they were at the top of the waiver wire. So smart business by Carolina, and I'm really excited about guys like Devon Key, like J.L. Skinner, because they both had very awesome camps. I wish Stearns nothing but the best, but this was the right move for the Broncos, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's just the way things were shaping out, and I think that Caden was trending toward being healthy a little bit, but he also needed to be healthy, and he kind of had just a very slight setback, and he did come back to practice, but unfortunately, it was all for naught. And I think that unfortunately, we say it so often, and right now it's trending upwards for guys like Greg Dulcich. But your best ability is availability. When you are available in practice and you are we'll talk about that side of it too, because you touched on the small part of it in terms of going forward with the younger guys. But if you're also not performing necessarily, then it's time to really cut your losses, and it's a very harsh reality of where especially that, because there's no doubt about it that talent level for Caden has never been a question. And I wonder if it was just maybe he was just too far behind the eight ball a little bit, maybe in the road to recovery, or maybe there was something else going on behind the scenes. But I will say this, and this kind of goes into what you were saying about the younger guys. It's been a theme, not just the safety room, but the whole roster in general. I know Stearns is young and his is a little bit more injury related, but they do want to go with some of their own guys, their own young players on the roster. And you mentioned Devon Key, obviously, Omar Brown, J.L. Skinner. The biggest winner of them all really is J.L. Skinner, though. And I think, obviously, KB brings it up, that hopefully he can be able to step up. He has, from everything that I've been hearing and seeing at camp. I know you've been there, Gage. Everything that it would certainly seem like from what you're seeing, he's really stepped it up. And I think that before you chime in there, Gage, I think it's fair to bring back and do a nice little callback to what Sean Payton talked about like a month ago back in OTAs when they asked about J.L. Skinner, and they said he was really starting to turn the corner around the scout team. Yeah, it was scout team, but it's really the little things that really make people take notice. And I think that for something like that, once Skinner really, it seemed like, started to get more of the IQ down, the intangible side of things in terms of playing safety, and then of course with coverage and everything that was starting to fall in line with really being a safety at the next level. Gage, it really started to kind of fall in line with him trending upwards in terms of playing time, and obviously it resulted in the result of Caden Stearns.
Yeah. And you can see with Skinner mentally, it's just clicking with him. He's not having to think out there. He's just reacting. He's just seeing ball and attacking ball, essentially. And that has always been his style of play. And he's always been very aggressive, but you have to be able to at times tame that aggression and be able to be in the right spot and be where you need to be. And he's done an excellent job of that throughout camp. And that's why I feel like this coaching staff has the confidence to give him all these snaps. And he's gotten that opportunity as well as Devon Key with Brandon Jones being out with his injury, because they've basically rotated both Skinner and Key alongside PJ Locke at that safety position.
And I think that, we talked a little bit about it with the safety position. It's not a huge loss. Yeah, Stearns, Locke, and Jones all played with one another at the University of Texas. But I think that the thing is, there was already so much versatility within the room, and specifically Brandon Jones. Obviously, the injury with Brandon Jones is still TBD. And maybe this is a little sidebar, maybe things are trending in the positive direction for Brandon Jones, for him to get back to the field if they are moving on from Caden Stearns. That's possibly another level to this. But I think people are underestimating about how athletic he is. Yeah, he's able to rush the passer. Yeah, he's able to be used in some creative ways, but he's a very athletic type safety in a lot of ways. That how Miami was using Jones is the way that we were using PJ Locke last year when the safety room was, Justin Simmons and Kareem Jackson at one point. So I think it offers a very much of a creative still mindset for you. And I think that when you talk about J.L. Skinner, I think there's also a difference between a practice player and a game player. And I think J.L. Skinner might fall in line based on his physicality. Now, granted, it is starting to translate a little bit into practice as far as one of those players, but you really are starting to maybe see those signs that he might actually be a game player. Because, when you're starting to see some of those signs in practice, Gage, where the physicality is being brought out and everything, he's one of those guys. And, the Broncos, if anything, they've needed a safety that is that enforcer again with the loss of Kareem Jackson. Yeah, some of those fines are really adding up, but it's meaningful, and it's noteworthy when you have a safety on that back end who can be almost that enforcer for you, the Cam Chancellors of the world, to use a guy that, Skinner has really looked up to, coming into the league.
Yep, 100%. And you just look at the makeup of the type of player that Skinner is, and he really has that ceiling of a Cam Chancellor just with his athletic ability, his ability to be around the football, and yes, his ability to lay the wood on people. That's what we like to see. But legally, of course, K-Jack, I really think that Skinner is going to be able to translate that really well as we get into the preseason and in turn the regular season. But I'm really going to be excited to watch Skinner in Indianapolis and during that joint practice versus Green Bay, because I think he's going to really get some good action and start laying the wood on people.
Yeah, well, who knows? He might actually be one of those people that we do mention, spoiler alert, that we do mention as we dive a little bit forward into the Indianapolis game. I'm very much looking forward to it. And obviously, he's not going to be the only one when it comes to those joint practices either. He's going to be one, amongst everybody that is wanting and basically chomping at the bit to hit some other, players that are not their own teammates now. So, so you can bet that some of those offensive linemen are, frothing at the mouth to his, so to speak. So, how exactly do you see guys like we talked about it briefly though, but how do you see it shaping out in terms of that safety room with how they use Skinner on the down and distances, or and on that back end? Like, how do you see the Broncos possibly using him? Because I feel like for Skinner, and some of the things that I've been mentioning for a few times, is what would be really nice for them to use him in would be maybe almost the Jamal Adams role. A player that could be, he's a box safety, and he's much younger, so he's going to have a little bit more coverage skills, obviously. But I feel like that would maybe be one of the more creative ways to use a guy like that. I mean, do you see it that way, or do you see a bit of a different role with how you would want to, now use a guy like that now with Stearns being gone?
Yeah, I definitely feel like you utilize him in that box safety role. You could utilize him as a blitzer, especially like on third down. I feel like if you could use him to bring pressure just from that defensive backfield area, that could really translate well. So I feel like that is probably the niche role for JL Skinner this year, assuming, of course, that Brandon Jones and PJ Locke can stay healthy. If those guys can't stay healthy, then we could easily plug Skinner back there, and I think that he'd be able to figure it out because he's been able to handle it well in camp to this point. Obviously, it's not full live speed, but when given that opportunity, I think he could do that really well. But right now, kind of that box safety, Jamal Adams niche role. And he does, of course, bring some of that versatility in coverage. He's really gotten better at that over the course of this offseason. So Skinner is almost one of those jokers on defense. You can do a lot of different stuff with him to keep the offense on their toes.
And I think that's why a lot of people are, with the loss of Caden Stearns, who's going to be that type of player that really takes on that role, like who's going to be that type of player, that's maybe going to either replace Stearns. And you touched on it. I mean, Brandon Jones was going to end up being probably the guy that takes, probably the PJ Locke role, and PJ Locke was going to be the guy that's going to, end up, maybe even taking the Justin Simmons type of role with the way that he was able to roam a bit in some of that free safety. So you talked about Joker. JL Skinner might actually fall into that role where he is that Joker. And I think that he would be a very big and very athletic type Joker if they wanted to use it, and especially given how aggressive Jim Leonard is as a coach. That's the other side of it too, that you really start to kind of think things through and be like, the Broncos may not actually be a team that you would want to mess with going forward with the way that they want to be truly that kind of physical team. Continuing the theme a little bit as far as the secondary, so it seems like there's some mixed. It's a mixed bag. It seems like there's been a mixed bag in correlation to the other part of the secondary, which has been that second corner. And let's just lead off with the surprise of the bunch in terms of mixed reviews. Guys, Damari Mathis is having a great camp. Damari Mathis is actually having a really good camp. He's actually been having some really good looks as far as cornerback too, but he's not the only one. Levi Wallace, who has been injured, and the hope is to get him back in camp here in just a little bit. He's been out there in terms of with cornerback too, and then obviously Riley Moss. And I feel like Riley Moss is the one that has been probably your mixed reviews. It depends on who you talk to. Some of the people that I talk to, it seems like he's actually been really good. He's had a few rough days, but I mean, it seems like he's been really good. But then some people you talk to, and it's been like, he's a bit rough out there. I mean, getting torched by Greg Dulcich and in some of those clips, which, by the way, people at training camp, you are the real piece for taking those videos. You might get them taken away for being at camp. That's beside the point, but please keep taking those videos. But thoughts on cornerback too? It does seem like it's a bit mixed reviews and a mixed bag a little bit with that position.
I gotta say, right now, Damari Mathis is starting to kind of pull away a little bit. He's held up really, really well in coverage. He hasn't had those meltdowns that he had last year. I'm curious to see if that's going to continue during the preseason when we're actually at live game speed. I'm curious how that's going to continue again during those joint practices with the Packers when we're going to get a lot more of those looks. But so far, it's been really good with him. Riley Moss, I will say, has kind of been up and down, up and down, up and down. But I feel like the peaks have been really, really high. Like, he's had some really good reps in coverage. But again, there's also been the moments where he's been torched. But there's a lot of positive to take away from Riley Moss. And he has a chance to close that gap between him and Mathis because it's not a large gap. But again, the preseason and those joint practices is going to tell a lot. The surprise of the depth chart for me was that they didn't list Levi Wallace as part of that rotation. They listed Damari Mathis or Riley Moss as the starter at that second boundary corner spot, but they didn't include Levi Wallace in that mix, who I thought was playing some good football prior to the injury. Perhaps that injury has set him behind the curveball a little bit, and he's not quite at that same level now as Riley Moss and Damari Mathis. That's going to be something to monitor because I thought he was playing good ball.
Yeah. And something to monitor, I feel like, with Damari Mathis. No, it doesn't go unnoticed that he's having a good camp. Lorenzo Doss come to mind, Broncos country?
Oh, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
Doss was a training camp sensation. He was a training camp sensation. But in preseason, or preseason or games, it unfortunately didn't turn out that way. Now, Mathis, at least to his credit, has played some rather solid football in the regular season. But for Mathis to really make a name for himself again, he's going to have to perform in preseason and at a rather high level to where he can really provide and be that cornerback too. I feel like the competition, I feel like, is very it's definitely heated. I feel like, but for definitely the quarterback too. But I'm with you. I feel like that's one where you probably want to lean a little bit more to the veteran, and maybe, just maybe, given the vacant seat a little bit right now with the safety room, maybe not to piss Iowa Hawkeye fans off or Iowa Hawkeye fans and Bronco fans, Sarah Benninger. Um, but uh, but maybe they move Riley Moss to safety, give him a little bit of some reps at safety. And obviously, we should at least throw this out there as far as the other possibility. And this is something that you and I caught. I want to say, especially when you and I were there, the 27th. I feel like 27th or no, it was the 26th. You and I caught something that was when we were kind of hearing back from Cecil and the feedback that he was getting. There was another corner who was getting some boundary looks. I don't know how much it's been since then. But the second best corner on the football team, Jaquan McMillan, has been getting boundary looks outside, Gage.
It's something they have experimented with. I know they love him at nickel, so I think they're going to keep him at nickel, but they have experimented with it, and he has held up well there. Their initial vision for him was going to be an outside corner, but he just developed so well when an opportunity came at the nickel spot when Usain Bassey absolutely crapped the bed in that Miami game and in that Chicago game. Jaquan McMillan comes in and he takes full advantage of that opportunity. But that doesn't mean that he can't thrive on the outside as well. I feel like that's more of a break glass in case of an emergency situation because then you've got to figure out a hole at the nickel spot. But if you have to break that glass, then Jaquan McMillan will thrive on the outside.
What's up, Clayton? Good to see you. As Clayton is saying, make sure you smash that like button and share. Have your friends tell their friends all about the 5280 podcast, but more importantly, the MHRT network. I think it's a very, outdated comparison, but it's a very good one. And that's when, people use the Chris Harris comparison a little bit with Jaquan McMillan. J-Mac is a bit small compared to Chris Harris. That said, though, I really like the fact you use the word emergency because I'm trying to recall back to Chris Harris's time because there was a point, I think there was an injury that went down around the time with Chris Harris, and then he stepped out on the outside, and he really provided a lot of stability there on that outside. And then once he was able to do that, he just became a true Swiss Army knife to where they were just able to use him on both the boundary and on the inside in a lot of different packages and a lot of different formations, for Wade and, for Vance Joseph for a certain little bit. I wonder if given that opportunity, if given that emergency situation for a guy like J-Mac, I wonder if, especially considering he's just been phenomenal in camp. And I think that there are legitimate arguments to be made from everything that we've been hearing and seeing in training camp. There's legitimate arguments to be made that J-Mac might be the MVP of camp right now. Like, he is playing that phenomenal. And if he can really be the type of player that they can possibly envision maybe on the outside, that once you put him there, it's going to be really hard to take him out of that.
Do we have our new Chris Harris and Aqib Talib here?
We might. Yeah, we definitely might. And, if Mathis is able to return to form, we'll finally get a chance to we'll finally actually get a chance to see what we were seeing, which was PS2 and Mathis finished the year very strong and with that optimism going forward. So I think it's a fun thing to think about. Yes, J-Mac, Pro Bowler 2024, but I'll give one better. All-Pro in 2024.
Book it.
Book it. Moving forward, Gage, with some of the other takeaways with camp, what has been some of the things that you've that have caught your eye, either in some of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about with the secondary, or just anything with the defense before we move on just a little bit?
Defensively, the competition at off-ball linebacker between Jonas Griffith and Cody Barton is very much real. Jonas Griffith has had a whale of a camp, and Cody Barton has been really, really solid as well. I think that both of those guys have been super dynamic at that position, and both of them could end up seeing significant snaps and maybe a rotational role, because I think it's going to be really hard to decide which one of those two you start. Cody Barton did an interview the other day. He's a very cerebral dude. So's Jonas Griffith, and he's competing his ass off. You could tell that he's got that competitive drive in him. Just the way that he's talking and the way that he's going about his business. That competition is very much real, and I want to watch that very closely when we get some more live contact in the Indianapolis game. And again, I keep referencing that joint practice against Green Bay. That's when we're going to learn a lot of shit, Broncos country. That is when we're going to learn pretty much everything we need to know, is those joint practices. So I keep saying, man, that competition is healthy, strong, and somebody's going to have to come out on top.
Yeah, our first official test is obviously going to end up being the preseason games, the first preseason game, and then after that is going to end up being the joint practice. But I like the fact that you talk about you talk about Cody Barton, and you talk about Jonas Griffith. Barton is such a fun one to talk about, because I don't think he's to the level of playing, with his hair on fire like Alex Singleton, but to a certain degree, there's some similarities. There are some similarities to Barton and Singleton, especially, given when they became Broncos, because, the last couple seasons for Barton, he was able to pick about 100 plus tackles a season, and, but, play some special team snaps here and there. Of course, been rather known as a special teams player. And he signs with the Broncos for roughly the exact same contract that Singleton did when he first signed with the Broncos. And why do I talk about all this? Because in preseason, in Singleton's first preseason, he was bad. That's just, he was really, really bad. And I think that, once the regular season hit, it's just like he wasn't either taking it serious or he was just trying to avoid injury. But the moment week one hit, it was like a completely new linebacker that you were talking about alongside Josie Jewell. And now obviously Josie's gone. You enter Cody Barton. So, but the Jonas Griffith stuff is also fascinating because you do see the athleticism. He is probably the most athletic linebacker that is, of that entire bunch. And that even goes even to the time when Josie Jewell was here, Kenny Young was here. Like Griffith was arguably the most, athletic. And who was the guy who, picked him up, traded for him there, Gage? It's Mr. Payton. It was George Payton. So, maybe this is just another thing, that's just is a nice little dart in Peyton's corner, for his player evaluation, which, I mean, he is a really, really good player evaluator when it comes to that's a separate point. But Griffith, if he's still my starter for who's going to be alongside of Alex Singleton. I think the one area where I think Barton is really going to help himself and, being a part of this team is the pass coverage. And I think that that's one of the things where he really seems like he really excels in. I think he definitely can run defend, but maybe not to the same level of guys like Jonas and, and Singleton.
So maybe you have Barton in as kind of your sub package guy when you're more in like nickel and dime, obvious passing downs because of his abilities as a coverage guy.
Right. And I would be kind of curious, going forward, do the Broncos, going forward and, with this preseason, much to the grain as we will talk about here at the quarterback position here, but I'd be kind of curious about, how they kind of mix and match those particular camp battles. Do they give a preseason for like a quarter? Or a few snaps here and there and just completely and just kind of alternate and see which one, works really well with Singleton. I'd be kind of see how well that works, especially given the situations. I tell you, one of the reasons why I give it to Singleton, to Griffith, is we know he's really valuable on special teams. We know that he's at least shown his worth a little bit at times on third down and third down pass coverage. I think I would rather give him the nod first, get a chance to see what crack he was going to have there, and if he's able to really make some hay and really be the hot hand early on, you roll with him a little bit for some snaps. Then you get a chance to see what Barton is going to be like, and then maybe you get a chance to see, for given certain situations and certain packages, what Barton and Singleton will do, given some packages and whatnot.
Then there's the Drew Sanders factor, because come October, Drew Sanders will be back in the fold. How does he rotate in? Does he rotate it off ball? Does he rotate it edge? Like, what happens with Drew Sanders? That's another question you have to factor in with all of this.
Yeah, and I think that it would be of the smart move to maybe make him an off-ball linebacker. To truly make him be that off-ball linebacker. And if that's able to do that, then you really are going to be talking about that true, the true chess piece, if you will, of that front seven, which is something that we've been trying to say for Browning, but Browning really became focalized on that edge room, and Drew Sanders felt like, maybe he's going to be the guy that's going to be opposite of Alex Singleton. Well, now you may actually look at it that he's going to end up being one of those chess pieces, coming back from injury. We teased a little bit as far as the quarterback position. It's probably, fair to start bringing this up a little bit. The big news of the day in regards to the depth chart, whether you're, those aggregate, sites that's over there on X and Twitter are running with it, and everything. But with the depth chart being out there, the number one quarterback and two quarterback is not Jarrett Stidham and Bo Nix, respectively. It is actually Jarrett Stidham, Zach Wilson, respectively, followed by Bo Nix. And actually, it is the rookies in general that are actually a little bit low on the totem pole. But we all know, Gage, so the first unofficial depth chart is something you do not take very, very seriously.
No, not at all. This is complete and total bogus. Sean Payton basically said so much without saying it during his presser today that if it were up to him, they would never release these depth charts right now. And basically, there's not much to truly take away from it. Bo Nix is very clearly not the third quarterback. Zach Wilson is. If you've been out at camp, or if you've been following reports coming out of camp, Zach Wilson has not taken a first-team snap in a week and a half, almost 2 weeks now. It's been a minute. Bo Nix, he has been alternating and getting more and more first-team reps as time has gone on, and he's looked better and better, especially over the last week. Mm-hmm. Bo has had some of his best practices in a row this past week. But the Broncos don't want to give that information away to the media, even though we can see it with our own eyes if we're there. Right. He doesn't want to give it away to Indianapolis, and they don't want to give it away to Seattle ultimately week one. They want to make this still look like a competition, even though it's very apparent, the proof is in the pudding, all roads are leading to Bo Nix, and they're leading to Bo Nix quickly.
Bo knows. Well, I was going to say actually Sean knows, but no, you're absolutely right, and I think that look, Stidham, he's also the incumbent. It's something that Mike Kliss has mentioned in his article and everything. Like, when you're an incumbent, it makes a lot of sense for you to still be the number one, the number one on your depth chart. And yep. Bo, I think maybe there's a little surprise that that he's not quarterback too, but I think that given the timeline, right? Given the timeline, of how all the events happened, it's not all that shocking whatsoever, because Zach was the next quarterback that they got before Bo Nix. So it's just, when you kind of read a little bit, it makes sense based on the chronological order of how things kind of shaped out. with that quarterback room. But yet, I'd argue it's really been Nix that's been taking a vast majority of the first team reps lately, specifically when the pads have really turned up. And that's, something of note is whenever it's been the padded practices, and the padded practices of the team practice and the team, side of things, it's been Nix that's been out there with the ones mostly, and I think that there's probably one area where we can look at, and that was probably the turning point, Gage, and it was, I think, the practice, unfortunately, that you couldn't make, and it was that Saturday one.
I was at that Saturday one, the scrimmage.
You were finally able to make it to that one.
I was at that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I knew that there was the time where you didn't have a ticket, and you couldn't get it. Yeah. But it was
that was before I got into the big one, the Saturday one, where Bo Nix did definitely stand out and separate himself, and that's where we can really look to and be like, okay, this is where it started.
Right. And what's interesting was it was a 7-on-7 of all things. It was a 7-on-7. It was a really bad ball that he threw that Levi Wallace intercepted. But after that point, when they decided to run with the team drills, it was like a closer's mentality in baseball. The light went on. It was like a very efficient and flawless offense that was being run in that red zone offense. Touchdown to Zolcic, touchdown to Pirine, I think touchdown to Michael Bandy, which we'll touch on Bandy here in just a little bit here too. But he's really stacking days. You will actually, I'm sure you've heard a lot of that, in terms of training camp with Bo, but he is stacking those days, Gage.
Yep, I've been preaching it.
Yeah.
And he's, even today, like, he had 2 touchdown passes during 7-on-7s. The last period, they had a 2-minute drill where they were looking for a field goal. Bo Nix marched right downfield and led them to that field goal. He's been efficient. He's been making the right decisions. And even when he doesn't make the right decision, he learns from it, and you don't see him make the same mistake twice. I hate to pivot this back to Zach Wilson because I give this man a lot of crap, but you see him making the same mistakes over and over again. Issues with his cadence that lead to false starts. You see him dirting screen passes over and over again because of inaccuracy. You see him throwing to the wrong shoulder of receivers, which in a real game would get him lit up. Just those little things that, quite frankly, Sean Payton wasn't willing to put up with it with Russell Wilson. I don't understand why he'd be willing to put up with it with Zach Wilson. So that's not something you're seeing from Bo Nix. And again, if you see it, you only see it once in a blue moon, and it doesn't happen again. That is what is separating Bo Nix from everybody else. Stidham has been steady and consistent, but he's not willing to push the ball downfield. His one big play that I really remember him having during camp came on a blown coverage because Traymon Smith caught his ankles up and fell down, and David Sills was wide ass open. That is pretty much the one massive explosive play that Jarrett Stidham has had, because I'm just going to be honest, he doesn't have the arm talent, and he knows he doesn't have the arm talent to really push the ball and be aggressive downfield in those tight windows. Zach trusts his arm a little bit too much. Bo is that happy medium where he trusts his arm to make those big time throws into tight windows, but he also will dial it back and take the check down if it's there. He's not immediately looking to make that big time throw like Zach Wilson is.
So what you're saying is that Bo Nix is not a check down quarterback, contrary to what what's been out there in terms of his college film. I see what you're going with, though. And of course, I think what really helps is, when you have a quarterback like Zach, not Zach, but I mean a quarterback like Nix, who's, in terms of stacking days from the middle part of last week to now, you're starting to really see the types of things that you and I were really starting to notice with his pre-draft process, which was what he's able to do pre-snap. Now that he's able to be a little bit comfortable, from everything that it seems like, for some of the people that have been able to take videos or what they've been able to see at camp, starting to feel like he's making some calls at the line of scrimmage, and making some audibles at the line of scrimmage. Heck, even Jaquan McMillan mentioned that he was getting ready to blitz on a certain play, and he audibled out of a play to hit a back out of the backfield, or to hit Vele or whoever it was, but he checked out of it. So it's starting to get to the point, yeah, it's training camp, yeah, it's practice, but it's starting to get to the point where things are slowing down for him. And the point that kind of leads us to our next topic of conversation is, it really feels like you're starting to get a sense of how good, but also possibly how underrated some of the members of this wide receiver room really are.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I talked about it in my breakdown of the Broncos depth chart today, that their wide receiver room is stacked, and they may end up having to move on from a good player just because of the fact that they might not have room for him. And that's a good problem to have. You've seen some of these back end guys like Michael Bandy and David Sills step up. Obviously, you've got your consistent guys like Brandon Johnson, Little Jordan Humphrey, and then your top four, Cortland Sutton.
Might as well have a wide receiver. I get what you're saying, but yeah.
I mean, he's basically a big slot receiver. Yeah. We'll talk about that later, but I consider him almost like a wide receiver. But anyway, obviously, Cortland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Tim Patrick, and Josh Reynolds have all been really, really solid and consistent throughout the course of camp. Timmy P's gotten better as the days have gone on, which is good news, because I know there was some early concern about Timmy P. Things have gotten much better there for him. But again, this back end of the roster, the guys like the Brandon Johnsons of the world, the Devon Vele's of the world, the Little Jordan Humphreys, all of those guys have really made this a tough decision to narrow things down in that room, because they've all made big plays. They've all been running good routes. They've all been in the right spot. They're all doing their job at an efficient level. So this receiving room is really fascinating right now.
Graham asks, is it true that Vele is ahead of Franklin? Yes.
Yeah.
It is. I will say this, though. He may, it may seem like Vele is ahead of him. I don't know how long that will stay in terms of, a year from now, right? A year from now, or maybe even as soon as the regular season hits. But Franklin is starting to kind of stack some days as of late. The last couple of practices dating back to, was it like Thursday or Friday this last week, and then now Monday and Tuesday, it seems like he's really starting to kind of stack some days a little bit. And I know a lot has been made about, the hard coaching and, everything with the coaching staff. But yeah, but I will say this, though, Gage, and obviously, you've been out there far more than I have, but Vele is an impressive human being. He, as far as a wide receiver, and the more he balls out in camp, the more myself and probably the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 fans that have been able to watch this in camp, yourself included, are probably wondering, how did this guy slide to the 7th round?
Dude, for real. During one-on-ones in the red zone, he was mossing cats left and right. He had 2 back-to-back plays where he went up and he mossed the defender. The dude is a physical freak of nature with his size, his catch radius. This dude is a specimen. And just as far as him being a little bit further along in his development than Troy Franklin is, that's to be expected. I mean, Troy Franklin, how old is he? Like 22, and then Vele's 26.
Yeah.
That's just the natural progression. I mean, Vele's played a lot more ball than Troy Franklin has. He's been around the block longer. He's just more experienced as a player and as a person. Franklin's still trying to figure stuff out right now, and that's okay. But like you said, he has been stacking days. It was yesterday. He had easily the most explosive play of training camp. It was a double move touchdown from Zach Wilson, of all people. And again, Franklin has had those really big flashes, especially over the last couple of days, but it's been more consistent with Vele. And also, I think Vele has a different skill set, obviously, than Troy Franklin, that the Broncos really covet.
I'll ask you this before we dive into the tight ends and the specific, the running back room and the offensive line. It's something that obviously that I've been pondering. I have a hot take on. I think where I stand on in terms of the wide receiver room in general about how many they truly keep. How many do they keep? Because like that, obviously the 5 is set in stone. Sutton, Mims, Patrick, Franklin. That's the 5, right? Sutton, Mims, Franklin, Patrick, and Reynolds.
Yeah,
those are the 5. Do they go as aggressive and they say, you know what? Do they keep 7? And I think that that's my hot take. Is I think they keep 7 because I just think that I keep thinking back to what Sean said, which is he really doesn't care overall about the number of people that they keep. It's about making sure he has the best roster, necessarily. So, Gage, how many wide receivers do they keep?
I'll meet you in the middle on the active roster and say they keep 6. I will say that they keep everybody that you mentioned plus Vele. Vele will be, I feel like, on the active roster. And I think that he could be one of those bigger bodies on special teams on the kickoff unit. That might help him stick out a little bit as well, along with his role on offense. And then I think they'll probably keep 3 guys on the practice squad and rotate them in through elevations. I think that'll be Brandon Johnson, Little Jordan Humphrey, and Michael Bandy.
Michael Bandy. Remember that name, people. Like, we're actually not kidding. Michael Bandy might actually even be a player that, given all the injuries and everything, that you actually see him get some playing time here during their season. Because, I mean, like, I'll be honest, like, the Broncos, I think, have versatile players who could be a slot receiver. I don't think they have a true slot receiver, and that's where a guy like a Bandy could really shine here, specifically with the Bo Nix and specifically with the offense. We all know that, that he wants to run. First things first, Rich, the other crew members, Mike is he's working right now, and Glenn is on a trip to Tulsa, and then I think from there he's headed to Arkansas. Virgil might be a practice squad guy. I'm always rooting for a guy like Virgil. You can definitely tell. That he's beefed up. Since his injury, he looks bigger, and he still looks the part at wide receiver. He's making plays. I think, unfortunately, Rich, as much as I would love to see him be on the Broncos roster, either practice squad or whatnot, I don't know about you, Gage, but it's going to be a really hard time for him to make the roster because of how deep that room is right now.
When I was talking about good players who might be the odd man out, Jalen Virgil is the first one that comes to mind because he's also had a really solid camp. He's also had some big plays. He's also looked really, really good as a slot guy, but he's just kind of buried so far underneath some guys that have really emerged that the injury that he had last year just set him back a little too far that he might be the odd man out. I could very easily see Jalen Virgil ending up on an active roster of some team somewhere this
Chargers.
Year because he could. I mean, he brings that skill set, like a team that's thirsty for talent at the wide receiver position, such as the Chargers. I mean, they could end up seeing him on their active roster, but as far as here in Denver, it's just so deep that I don't think he makes it.
And when we're saying deep, we're obviously not necessarily talking about deep relative to the NFL, just based on what we're seeing in camp and how everybody's been able to perform. When we say deep, that's exactly what we talk about. So, and to Rich, I do think it is a dying position to a degree, but I think there are teams in the NFL today that really make it successful with those slot receivers. Tampa Bay would be a really good example. Chris Godwin is a really good slot receiver, but obviously he can be used on the outside as well. San Francisco would be another option, right? As far as, teams that would really utilize the slot receiver. So I think that, yeah, I do think it's a dying breed, but I think that there's certain teams that you still find use those types of, slot receivers. Obviously, we know that, it's been a huge, theme with like the New England Patriots and everything with Tom Brady, but I will agree. I do think it's a dying position, but I think there's a few teams. It's like the fullback position. I think, like teams use the fullback position. Obviously, we have Michael Burton here, but there's only a few teams that use the fullback position. There's only a few teams that use the slot receiver. The tight end position, Gage, and of course, the running back position. It's appropriate that we lead off with, two of maybe the biggest takeaways of camp entirely, and that would be. No, not the best player on the football team, unfortunately, Lucas Kroll. But Greg Dulcich and Javonte Williams are probably, the front runners for the MVPs of camp so far. Javonte looks fantastic. He's back down to his playing weight from when he was at North Carolina and back into his rookie year, which is, he also shed the brace, which I will bring up that point to no end. He has no brace on his knee in camp, and Greg Dulcich looks fast.
Yeah. And as far as Greg Dulcich is concerned, there's already a lot of people concerned because he's listed as tight end 2 on the depth chart behind Adam Troutman. We'll talk about that. Greg Dulcich has a certain role that he fills that's not necessarily a true inline tight end, but that's okay. He can still be a big-time impact on this team. But talking about Javonte Williams first, oh my God, dude, he looks incredible. He's cutting well. His vision's good. He's not running like he has cinder blocks attached to his cleats anymore. I'm really impressed. He looks like the pre-injury Javonte Williams, and the fact that he was able to shake off that nasty injury, it took him a year to do it, but the fact that he was able to do that, just hats off to him. I'm really pleased with Javonte Williams. And the rest of this running back room, again, man, there's a lot of talent in that room, but Javonte Williams is the clear-cut RB1.
Yeah, man. So real quick, we just talked about the wide receiver room, and I think it's at least fitting we talk about as rich as Yasmin. He might be a practice squad guy. I think what makes Yasmin fascinating is I feel like he could be a one-trick pony in this, or not a one-trick pony. It sounds bad. There's too much like him right now in the room. I think the moment they added a guy like Vele, I think, is to where I just feel like it could be a little bit of a crowded room based on the versatility that he offers. And I think that, Yasmin is a bit thin for a tight end, which, makes you wonder if they want to have him at wide receiver. But even to that point, he's a bit big for a wide receiver. So it could just be a big slot receiver. But therein lies what, the conversation, right, Gage, of like guys like Vele and, little Jordan Humphrey and, possibly Sutton or even, Patrick to a certain degree, given on some certain, snaps and stuff. So I like Yasmin. But I think the true, determining factor here for a guy like Yasmin will be those preseason games.
If the NFL did what college did and just designated players as like athlete as a position, I think that's what we would end up doing with Thomas Yasmin. He's still kind of trying to figure out the tight end position relative to his route running and just overall his assignments and stuff like that. He's very raw, we'll put it that way, but the athletic talent is there. You could probably develop that on the practice squad, but he still has a long way to go.
Before we jump back into the running back position, Graham asks, what percentage do they do 11 on 11?
Man, I would say that they probably do about 45% 11 on 11s, 55% like 7 on 7s and 9 on 7s, stuff like that.
Okay.
I feel like it's been a little bit more of that, but they did have a scrimmage on a Saturday where it was basically all 11 on 11, as close to live contact as you're going to see in a practice situation. So they do have those kind of drills for sure, but the 7 on 7s have been a big point of emphasis. Usually it's like 2 11 on 11 periods, one like move the ball 2-minute drill period, and then a couple of 7 on 7 periods.
Got it. Yeah, when you're talking about Javonte, the Broncos really need that guy. It's almost, there's a lot of similarities with how we talk about the position groups with the Broncos. They need this guy to separate, be this wide receiver one. They need this guy to separate, be a running back one. They need this guy to separate, be edge one. There's some themes here, with this roster. But I think that if there is a player who could really emerge and be that running back that they could possibly have, for this team and be a running back one, I think it is Javonte. The question just would remain, with some of these other guys on the roster in the future, what are those future plans? And I think that, based on role and especially future with the team, I think Javonte is so fascinating because I've used this comparison a little bit, in the past with Javonte, but if you were to make a comparison to some of those past Saints teams, if there's a back who compares rather favorably to the Mark Ingram type back that Sean is very familiar with, Javonte really fits that bill. He's obviously far more younger and a little bit more athletic, obviously, even still with that injury, the knee injury that he sustained, but I think that, he's definitely a guy that you could probably rely on in pass protections and, really down and distance situations in those short yardage and truly being almost like a reliable guy. But we know that Sean, he really doesn't go off of those 3-down, running back types. I mean, he's really a running back by committee in terms of how successful it is. And I think that that's what's really going to be so fascinating because, Audric Estime, he's another guy that's going to be feeding off of those joint practices. And, of course, those preseason games, he's really starting to kind of come along a little bit, popping Omar Brown. But Omar Brown, he stood his ground. He could have easily fallen on the ground, and he decided not to. And obviously that wasn't the case. So that's okay, to each their own. I mean, people want to knock Omar Brown, but he didn't fall down. It's okay. It's okay. But then you get Jaleel McLaughlin and Blake Watson. I want to talk to you about this angle with it being Jaleel and Blake in terms of the running back room and why they keep 4, the kickoff. Because there was a moment, and granted, I've only been to 2 practices so far. It was the 26th and the 27th. It was right around the point in time when Watson was injured. But there was one takeaway that I had in watching those new kickoffs. They're cool, for one. But I saw some offensive linemen in there. I will admit, I saw some offensive linemen in there. I think it was Gargulio who was there. Saw a couple fullbacks, Burton, Atkins. But why am I talking about this? Because Tyler Beatty and Jaleel McLaughlin were on those kickoffs to a certain degree. So do you think there's a way where you could keep 4 and particularly those 4, a guy like Blake Watson and Jaleel, might actually end up being some kickoff return weapons?
Could. Very, very possible. I think that Blake Watson's going to have to show a little bit more offensively before we go down that route, just because do you want to keep him strictly as a special teams guy? He's had some struggles offensively, kind of getting back into the fold a little bit from his injury, but it is very possible, I will say that, because of the different ways that they're utilizing personnel on these kickoff returns. I won't go too much into it because I know the Broncos are really trying to keep it close to their chest with some of these groupings, but the way that they're utilizing them in terms of the way that returners are setting up and the number of returners that are back there, that's a little hint I will give. That is something to keep an eye on for sure, because Blake Watson and Jaleel McLaughlin go fast.
Mm-hmm. They do. And Jaleel was, I will say Jaleel was on kickoffs. Jaleel was on kickoffs from what we were able to see. And
Yeah, and that's no secret. That's on the depth chart.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I think that just the running back, room in general, I'm very curious to see. I think 4 is definitely the number they keep. I think that's very. If you were to probably give one of those safe answers, and really make sure that you're making a safe prediction, 4 running backs seems to be rather that safe prediction right now for the Broncos. And I was having the conversation with Mario on Saturday in regards to Samaje Perine.
Yeah.
It isn't so much that Perine is bad or that he's terrible. It's just about like a guy like a Jalen Virgil to a degree. Obviously, Perine's a much better player than Virgil, but he's just a victim of a crowded room. He's a victim of a crowded room, but more importantly, he's a victim of a younger running back room. And we all know that the running back position is a very revolving door type position. And in the day and age of where Sean Payton wants to go with things, he really wants to go younger, it feels like, at that position. So that's where I think we're rolling with the idea that Perine may end up being a possible trade candidate, or he could end up being just a straight release candidate.
I think the Broncos save more money if they release him, if I'm not mistaken. So they may go down that direction. Also, that would give him the freedom to choose his next team, which I think as a veteran, do him right at least by that. So I could see a scenario where he's just flat out released, and he's a victim of the Broncos being able to save $3.5 million by cutting him. That's another factor into this equation. And it's, again, not that Perine's a bad player. Sean Payton complimented what he's able to do on third down the other day, and he's still able to fill that role. But when you've got a guy like Audric Estime and you've got a guy like Jaleel McLaughlin back there who can collectively fill that role as almost a 1-2 punch, obviously Estime you trust more in a pass protection situation because of his bigger frame. He's a guy that in short yardage and red zone situations can give you pay dirt. I think that's where Estime is going to fit in. And then obviously Jaleel as kind of that scat back, that Darren Sproles type of player. I think that's where you're going to see him. It just kind of leaves Samaje Perine as the odd man out because he's a more expensive, slower, and older version of what those two players as a tandem can bring.
Yeah. It's going to be really interesting to see as far as that running back position, how it all shakes out. We end it, of course, with the offensive line. The offensive line.
Well, did we get into tight end, like the depth there? I think we need
sure.
to talk about more like Greg Dulcich's role and stuff like
that.
Sure. So with Greg Dulcich, because he is listed as tight end 2, I've seen some fans in my comment section kind of question that. It's the same thing as last year, where Troutman is your starter as your inline wide tight end, your guy who's going to block for you, your guy who's going to chip, your guy who's going to do the dirty work, basically. And then you've got Greg Dulcich as kind of your F guy, your move guy, your guy you can split out as a big slot. There's so many different things you can do with Greg Dulcich as a joker. And again, he's going to have a big role. It's just not going to be as an inline tight end where you're really exposing him with his smaller frame to having to block and get overwhelmed in that area. And just some other things as an inline tight end that Greg doesn't do very well, but that doesn't mean he's not a weapon. He's another one of those guys where I just would almost put him as like a positionless player because you can do so much stuff with him. You can split him out wide. You can split him as a big slot. You can put him in line at times. You can put him in the backfield as kind of a fullback. Like there's so much stuff that you can do with the Greg Dulcich because of the versatility that he brings and the athleticism.
Yeah. And I think that, I think back to the conversation, I think back to the conversation that we've been having even when Jerry Jeudy was here in terms of what we saw with the future. We'll save the Jerry Jeudy stuff for a bit later because we're previewing the others for maybe another show. But I just think that, with Sean Payton, there were two guys. There were two guys that we felt like were going to be the biggest beneficiaries of Payton's offense, and it was Judy and it was Dulcich. Obviously, Dulcich did not work out last year, given the injury and everything, but the way he operates in space, the way that he operates, as a space creator, is, I think, a very, it's a very valuable, role to have with Payton, and specifically the position of tight end. Yeah, Troutman, reliable. He's basically, you could just lump him into the, the Owen Daniels, the, Joel Dreesen types of, tight ends that the Broncos have. Reliable tight ends. You can definitely count on them. They're not explosive.
Nope.
You just got to call it for what it is. They're not explosive. Jeff Hireman, you could probably roll him into that maybe a little bit as well. Hireman was probably a little bit more explosive, but due to the injuries and everything, he became an Adam Troutman. But
both wearing number 82.
Both wearing number 82. But Dulcich, I mean, those were space eaters. Jake Butt was a space eater, but he went down for injury. And I think that, when you finally be able to have that on the field and have it for 18 games, I can't even begin to tell you the impact. I don't even know what's a much bigger impact, having a capable quarterback back there under center, or having a very reliable tight end who can work the middle of the field and get downfield and, work underneath and, be that
option routes,
for the option routes, or at least hold the block just enough, even if he's not a good blocker, but holding the block just enough and getting open and, doing the things that Travis Kelce's been able to do in the AFC West for decades. And, or even Darren Waller when he was with the Raiders, just doing those explosive things, that those types of tight ends have been able to do. It's invaluable. And I mean, so I think that having that kind of, performance from Dulcich, it's a lot to ask for, and for sure. But I think just having him for those 18 games and having him healthy is priority number one, because like Caden Stearns, the talent is 100% there, and just ask Riley Moss about that.
Yep. And I'm glad you brought up Travis Kelce, because think about Kelce's game. He's not a guy that's known as a blocker whatsoever. He's a guy that's known as a space eater, a guy that sits down in zone coverage, a guy that is just very quarterback friendly in the way that he plays. And I think that Greg Dulcich can be a very similar quarterback friendly type of player.
Yeah. And Graham, he's far more athletic than Jake Butt. The thing with Jake Butt that made him, so good coming out of college pre-injury was he was a Jason Witten. I mean, he was a guy that was a George Kittle before George Kittle. I mean, like he was the guy that's going to be able to block for you and be able to, receive the ball out of the backfield, be a really, really good tight end. Dulcich, he's more of your Julius Thomas, actually. Like he's like your true receiving threat, but yeah, as far as circumstances, though, you're right. You just hope it doesn't turn out the way it did for Jake, unfortunately, and retire. Yeah. So now moving forward, let's round out the tight end position real quick. There is a guy I want to touch on because I wonder if they do make him to the point where Michael Burton is expendable, and that is Nate Atkins. And I've been using this a little bit at times before, but the Kyle Juszczyk type of role where he's been able to be a fullback tight end, flexible weapon like that, I think at least should give the Broncos some thought going forward. I think Burton's a very valuable, player and has been with Sean Payton. You can't really count those types of players out. But the people that are fullback / tight end and block should at least give the Broncos a very strong look into that position about maybe carrying a little bit more tight ends there. And given the current comments or the recent comments of Sean Payton that said he's not worried about Greg Dulcich's blocking. So maybe because of that, you bring on a guy like a Nate Atkins just simply for that blocking.
Or you keep both of them, because Burton is so valuable on special teams. And with the new kickoffs and the bigger bodies up front, I don't want to lose that. But Nate Atkins brings you more versatility on offense. So I know I said you don't necessarily want to keep a guy just for special teams, but Michael Burton might be a guy I'd make that exception for because of the different stuff that he can do. He's one of the captains, or I don't know if he was not officially a captain. He's one of the leaders. Yeah, he's one of those big cats on special teams that knows what he's doing. He's always there to do his assignment. He's not going to screw up. That's so valuable. And so I'd keep Burton just for that alone. But I totally agree with you in terms of Nate Atkins, because the Broncos have utilized him in sort of that hybrid fullback tight end, Kyle Juszczyk type role, but they don't want to tip their hand to it. So he's still listed as a tight end on the depth chart. Michael Burton's the only fullback listed, but keep an eye on that at camp because he is being utilized in that role.
You're most welcome, Glenn. And if you find a bag, next to you, make sure you toss your salad. That's a nice little callback to the Mario episode for anybody that hasn't been paying attention. Graham asks, just as we round out and finish the tight end, any concerned about the Mims usage on offense while he's returner? Not necessarily. And actually, I think that, I think I even had a tweet about it, Gage, but I was like, if there is one player that I am very confident in and that they're going to be, utilizing him and putting a lot of stock in for a player that's going to have maybe the most usage, it's Marvin Mims by a mile. Like the way that they're probably going to be able to use him in that offense, and of course with the return game, he might be the fantasy darling for the Broncos.
Yep. Well, I hinted earlier at the Broncos using split returners. I wouldn't be surprised if teams would be afraid to kick it to Marvin Mims and they kick it to the returner on the other side instead. So that might decrease his usage just because he might not be seeing that many looks because teams are afraid to kick it to him. But no, I have no concerns whatsoever about that. He's done well offensively, and he's done well on special teams so far. I have no concerns about that whatsoever.
Honestly, when you don't hear anything about Marvin Mims, it's good news about Marvin Mims. I mean, he looks really good out there. Like he looks great. Finishing up with the offensive line and the people that will be protecting Bo Nix. It's worth noting that probably the biggest takeaway is what's happening at center. Yeah. Luke Wattenberg, got to give credit where credit is due. He's been actually taking most of the first team reps, at training camp. I think he's been solid. I think from what's interesting here though is when you read some of the stuff at camp, from what I've been able to read, Gage, and you can chime in on this since you've been at camp more than I have. It seems like Wattenberg's been fine. He's been solid, and he's had a fair amount of first team reps. However, when you put Forsythe in there, who is listed at number 2 on the depth chart, it seems like the offensive line as a whole is a bit more cohesive, and actually it seems like it flows more when it comes to the running game specifically.
Yes. Yep, definitely. I was going to say the exact same thing. The run game is where you notice it with Alex Forsythe. He is the much more superior run blocker to a guy like Luke Wattenberg. And I think it's also just setting the slides of the offensive line and setting all those schemes in terms of the running. I think that he does a really good job of handling all that up front, the line of scrimmage. That may be an area where Luke Wattenberg still needs to grow and get better. But just as a pure raw run blocker, I think that Alex Forsythe is the more aggressive. Just he's got that maul you mentality. Yeah. You've got to have that if you're going to be able to be an aggressive run blocker, and he's got that. So I would say that in the run game, that's where you really notice it with Alex Forsythe. But Luke Wattenberg, just like you said, you've got to give him credit where it's due, because 2 years ago, 1 year ago, I viewed Luke Wattenberg as an unstartable player, just a guy you couldn't even really trust in a backup role. Yeah. Now he is somebody that you can go out there and you can put him out there and you can at least trust him to not go out there and die. And that was not the case last year, is that he would not survive out there. especially his rookie season when he got action. He was atrocious. He was, in the wise words of myself, absolute booty cheeks. But now, again, this is a perfect example of how a player can flip the narrative over time. And Luke Wattenberg has done that. So hats off to him. But I will say, because of the fact that the Broncos want to run the hell out of the rock this year, I think that it's probably going to end up being Forsyth because of what he brings in the run game.
And there's a certain connection there with a certain quarterback.
Of course.
Yeah. We had to, of course, talk about that elephant in the room there for a little bit. Mike McGlinchey, of course, was missing practice, but he returned due to the birth of a kid that came to the family. We want to wish the wife a recovery, of course, and obviously congratulations to the baby that entered the world. So congratulations to McGlinchey. It is interesting because you look at that room specifically from the swing tackle perspective, and the injury to Quinn Bailey. I know a lot of people or a few people were chiming in on our stream for mainly and even 5280 at times when we talked specifically about the injury, and it was kind of described as a major loss. I give Mike credit that it was a bit of a clickbait article. I wouldn't say it was a major loss from the bigger landscape, right? But when you break it down, it's a major loss depth-wise because you have no idea what's going to transpire from the swing tackle. And I think that when Mike McGlinchey did step away due to the birth of the child, the question was just going to become, okay, who's going to take that spot? And Alex Pavcheski was the first one up, and he took that rep. Now, Pavcheski is interesting because the majority of his career with Illinois has been nothing but right tackle. But you watch the preseason last year with the Broncos, he played some left tackle, he played some right tackle. He looked solid at it. He actually looked solid and looked the part. And that'd be a fun conversation with guys like Mark Schlereth and some of those offensive lineman guys about like what the difference would be between a left tackle and a right tackle. I can't imagine it being too much, between left tackle and right tackle, but it seemed like he looked the part, Gage, as far as being a part of the left tackle and right tackle. So it seemed to me that starting from there is our preview for the offensive line, and given the injury, Pavcheski's front in line to be that swing tackle for who they want at left tackle and right tackle.
Yep. Oh, I've heard from offensive linemen, and this is kind of a weird way of explaining it, but this is how they explain it. Switching from left to right tackle is kind of like trying to wipe your ass with your non-dominant hand. That's kind of what I have heard. It's like that's what Mark Schlereth, I think, has said before, actually, about trying to play the other position. It's just you have to do everything basically the opposite of how you're used to doing it. And it can be awkward for some players, but for other players, it comes natural to them. Alex Pavcheski, it seems like it's one of those players where it comes more natural to him. And
that's what I figured.
I do feel like, and I think Sean Payton said this the other day, that they like Pavcheski more at right tackle, and that's where he's starting to settle in, is at right tackle, and then Matt Parrott at left tackle. But pivoting back to the Quinn Bailey conversation for just 1 second, where it is going to hurt the Broncos is they probably won't be able to run as much jumbo as they did last year with the sixth offensive lineman on the field. That was they were really good at quarterback sneaks last year, and they ran it out of jumbo. Short yardage run situations, they'd run it out of jumbo with Quinn Bailey, and he was really good in that role. Will Pavcheski or Matt Parrott or one of the other guys be able to step in? That remains to be seen. But in terms of the actual just swing tackles, I think that Pavcheski and Parrott pretty much have those clinched pretty firmly right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was exactly it. And it seems very fitting that if it did come from Mark Schlereth, and the way that you described it, that description would come from a guy like, Stink, as we like to call Mark Schlereth.
Yep.
Yeah. So moving forward with that other side of the conversation, I think what makes the Pavcheski angle we don't need to talk about it much now, but the Pavlovsky angle for the future of what could happen with the left side, a bit interesting, with him maybe being groomed a little bit for that, that left tackle position, maybe post Garrett Bowles. I think it's going to be a very interesting angle, to watch. Do I think it happens? I don't think so, but it's a fun little angle to go for. Anyway, Garrett Bowles looks solid. He looks good. He looks like he's really been able to hold it down. Ben Powers has actually been okay. He's definitely better than what he was last year. That's a very clear indication for what I've been able to see in camp. It's far and away better than what it was, when he was signed and he was a fresh free agent, coming to the Broncos in year one. I think there's still some growing pains, at least from what it feels like, at least with practice. And maybe he's tweaking things. It's something that you and I mentioned, last year with Powers. Maybe he's tweaking on certain things schematically. But he does look better. He does look like he's acclimated a little bit. He's used to the offensive line now. So, but I think overall he's done okay. We talked about Wattenberg. Then you get to the certain guy over there that's the belly.
Yeah, that guy.
Yeah.
He's only the best right guard in the NFL.
Yeah, the guy who, just got paid, that basically, forced Gage to hop off the 5280 podcast stream and go record something out the, on his syndicate page. That guy, that guy. I think overall, I think the offensive line will be fine. And you guys know this. I'm not one truly to really dogpile on anybody, but I know that things are cohesive as a unit. And I think that again, I'm not trying to personally dogpile on a previous quarterback, because you guys know how much I do like Russell Wilson as a player, as a person, and as a quarterback in his, in his overall career.
Me too.
But it's just like, I do think that you will see, to a certain degree, the better offensive line play that you guys were seeing under Russell Wilson. Now, maybe got blinded a little bit because of the scrambles and the runarounds, and so I think having guys like Stidham and Nix behind center will help us, a little bit in terms of, being a much more cohesive unit. I think it's fair to say that the Broncos offensive line is, at the very least top 12 in the National Football League, if not just a bit higher. And I would not be surprised, actually, call it a hot take. I think at the end of the season, the Broncos will finish with a top 6 offensive line by season's end.
I could not agree more. I think that we saw it last season, and sorry, Russ, but he dragged the offensive line down last year. That's just the facts. There's a very famous clip of him against the Patriots where he had Jerry Jeudy coming across the field wide open, but he doesn't trust his protection and ultimately spins into a sack. And I gotta say, man, and Bo Nix gets the ball out lightning quick. He hits the bottom of his drop. It's open. It's gone. And he utilizes the middle of the field. He actually throws dig routes. He actually throws over the middle of the field, dude. That is such a big difference that's going to help the offensive line tremendously, because he can actually see the entire field. He's not limited to only reading half of the field. And so the ball's going to come out quick. It's going to come out on time and in rhythm, which is going to help the offensive line. But I want to give a shout out to Mike McGlinchey, because he has had a phenomenal camp. I mean, he has been giving Baron Browning and Jonathan Cooper both hell. He has been really good with his footwork. He's been really good with his hands. I got to give Mike McGlinchey a lot of credit. He looks fantastic.
Wow. You really have not heard much about Mike McGlinchey. And the old adage, and we said it even just on the show today, it's just no news is good news. Like, when you don't really hear much in terms of a player, it means they're doing a really, really good job. So that's really good to see, especially from someone, for people that are kind of, call it maybe the weakest link of the offensive line. And, while they were top 12, he may not be playing like it. Is that kind of like what you would say? Like he's not playing like maybe like the weakest link?
No. I would say if you had to point a weak link on that line right now, it's got to be Ben Powers. And again, he's gotten better over the course of camp. It hasn't been a complete disaster. But
like last year, especially because it was rough.
It was rough last year.
Yeah.
But I want to say it was either like day 2 or day 3. Powers had a bad day, and everybody started to freak out like, oh no, Ben Powers is sucking again. But then he started to rebound, and he started to kind of like Bo Nix stack some days in camp. And I haven't seen many problems from Ben Powers. He did kind of get bullied a little bit in one-on-ones by Zach Allen, but let's just be honest, Zach Allen does that to a lot of people during one-on-ones. It's not just a Ben Powers thing. Yeah. But he has stacked days, and he has gotten better. I will still consider him right now the weak link on that offensive line.
Okay. Obviously we went a bit long, but there's so much to talk about.
It's training camp, man.
It is training camp. There's so much to talk about. We haven't got a chance to preview or talk about the preseason. So people that are in the chat, I see Big Mike that has entered the chat, Mr. Miners Muse. If you've not followed him, they're over on Twitter. But yeah, in terms of preseason, if you guys feel like you guys want to chime in about who you guys are looking out for, who you guys are looking for in terms of performing, feel free to chime in the chat. That's kind of like where we're gearing for now in terms of the preseason and the Indianapolis Colts. Obviously, number one, we don't need to say it. It's numero uno when it comes to the preseason and specifically training camp. Come away healthy. Numero uno, come away healthy. I will actually phrase a couple of these questions for you a bit differently. Or maybe one question that's a bit different than maybe some of these people are going to actually, ask it. A couple are probably popular, which is one, is there a player you are most excited about to watch? And two, is there a player that you feel like you're looking forward to see if he's got a lot to prove in terms of, from what you're seeing and what you've seen at camp in terms of stacking those days and having it, translate to the preseason? And three, this is that different angle I want to go with. Who's a player that could be advertised? Because this has been a theme lately with George Payton and Trinity Benson and Alberto Cuebanam. Who's a player that could be advertised and get traded possibly or moved for some draft capital?
Okay, let's go. So as far as players who I'm looking forward to seeing in the preseason, Bo Nix is obviously the lowest hanging fruit, so I'm not going to spend too much time on him. We're all looking forward to seeing what Bo can do. But Audric Estime, because he's been such a dominant force in camp, I want to see that carry over into real life speed where he can pop somebody the way he popped Omar Brown in a real life tackling situation. I'm looking forward to that. We touched on JL Skinner earlier. I'm looking forward to see how well he does in a real game situation. There's so many more that I can name, but those are the top three that come to my mind. Now, as far as somebody that George Payton might be thinking about as a showcase guy, we touched on him, but Samaje Perine, he could, even though, again, cutting him could be a better option, if the Broncos want to get a draft pick back for him, maybe they try to showcase him and be like, hey, man, we've got this back available that could really fill a good niche role on your team. Come on with a 6th round pick. Come on with a 7th round pick. I think that Samaje Perine, just because he's kind of already on his way out the door, that might be one where the Broncos are trying to be like, okay, let's get some draft capital here. Or Jalen Virgil, because he's kind of on the outside looking in too. He could be like the next Trinity Benson. He could be the guy that, has some big plays in the preseason, and the Broncos know he's probably not destined to make the team just because of the math. Maybe they try to give him a big game in the preseason finale against Arizona and then flip him.
It's funny you say spoiler. I mean, I'll just lead up with. I was gonna say Jalen Virgil. So like the fact that you went with Samaje Perine, which is obviously that's the easiest answer. But Jalen Virgil was the one that really kind of came to mind for me. Was especially given Trinity Benson, and if there's specifically preseason, which is a tad bit more offensive heavy, you would kind of lean a little bit more to those offensive players, and that's why Jalen Virgil really feels like it would come to mind. And so I think that he just, you can see the talent. It's unfortunately probably not going to work out long term, and they might be able to squeeze out as a late sixth and possibly a seventh for a very desperate team. And interestingly enough, some of those picks have worked out in the sense that maybe not necessarily draft picks, but they're able to get out a couple draft picks for a guy like Trinity Benson. And Benson actually, for as much as he was a household name in Denver, hasn't worked out there in Detroit or another team that he may be on now. So
it's Detroit.
Yeah, he's not exactly been a household name. So they basically were gifted 2 draft picks for a player that not exactly a household name. So
and I want to say they flipped those picks into like 2 notable players too.
Jonathan Cooper. So like
that's right. Yeah, Cooper was one of them, I think.
So that actually might. So that's probably a good way to look at it. Would you actually take Jonathan Cooper over, a Trinity Benson right now? Absolutely, especially given with him not necessarily being edge one. So I will go with who's a player I'm excited about. Obviously, we're going to lead with the very obvious, which is going to be, of course, Bo Nix, as you talked about. I'm excited to see Blake Watson. I think Jaleel would be one of those other easiest answers. Given his story, he's such a great guy to root for. But I'm looking forward to Watson. He's such an explosive player. What is it going to look like, in that setting, right? What's going to look like into that setting? And then on the defensive side of the ball, it's funny. Big Mike brought up Reese Taylor. He's a corner. There's 2 corners that I would want to file away a little bit, maybe for the practice squad or another football team, in the NFL. Reese Taylor is one, but the guy that I wanted to focus on as far as that I'm actually really excited about is Art Green. Art Green is the other corner that I'm really excited about. Those are the 2 corners that I feel like have really surprised a lot of people between, Devin Key, right? Because Devin Key's been like a corner safety, right? Kind of like Omar Brown, but like Devon Key's been above him. And so I think that, looking at a guy like Art Green, he fits the mold of the new NFL way things are shaping out in terms of that cornerback room. He's like 6'2". He's built almost like a running back, the way that he's structurally built. And he's a former track star, either in college or, in college. So a guy who's 6'2", built roughly like a running back. I mean, the developmental traits are clearly there, it feels like. So I think Art Green is certainly a type of player that I would want to file away and get a chance to see. And if I'm not mistaken, he was on the practice squad for a certain amount of time, last year. And it seems like they want to try and invest something out of him and see if they can groom him into, possibly being a corner, and he's going to be a fun little wrinkle. Obviously we get a chance to talk about Chris Abrams-Drain, one of your favorite players, but he's had a really solid camp. So down the line, Art Green, what is it going to be like for him, say next year, going forward in that 3rd year necessarily? What will it be? Will he be able to take that kind of next step down the line, or will he take a next step here in preseason and really show out his talents? And so, and as far as, the third one, as I said, it's Virgil, like, the player that I feel like could really showcase the talent, and, they move on from, obviously, Perine. Perine is the easiest answer because, the question is just going to be who. I think the very obvious answer, if they do move on from him, is the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's reunite him with the Cincinnati Bengals. And maybe the Bengals will be a bit more desperate, knowing the fact that Mixon is gone and, maybe they screwed the pooch a little bit by moving on from Mixon, and they really miss Samaje Perine. I know Cincinnati Bengals fans really miss Samaje Perine, so I'm sure that they would love to have him back. And maybe they're a bit desperate and trade us some draft capital for him. Who knows?
And
but
they wanted Perine back when he signed with Denver, but Denver offered him more money. Like, the Bengals were pretty upset when they lost Perine, so I would not be surprised at all if they wanted to bring him back for that reason.
Yeah. But anything else, as we're rounding out, anything else? I know we went just a little bit more long on the show, but anything else that you can think of, in terms of what we missed, training camp, preseason, anything that we may miss, Gage?
Well, I know we could probably keep going for hours on end, but I think this is probably a good stopping point.
I agree. But nonetheless, if you still want to, hear us talk about the Broncos, or you don't want to hear us, shut up, if you will, make sure you follow Gage over here and follow the work that he does over at the host of Broncos Syndicate. And, of course, follow him there over on Twitter at Gage Madrid NFL. Follow myself at Cameron Parker PO. We will be doing a show tomorrow at Manly Broncos. We'll continue to preview a little bit more about the Indianapolis Colts game, talk about Caden Stearns a little bit more. Some of the stuff might be regurgitated in terms of Manly Broncos, but that's okay. Stay tuned for another episode of the Manly Broncos podcast tomorrow. It's been a pleasure. Make sure you like and subscribe for the MHRT Network on YouTube. The guys, the whole crew, might be back next week. Who knows?
Allegedly.
But nonetheless, we love doing this with you guys. Make sure you tune in next week for another episode of the 5280 podcast. Peace.
Fast lane when I pass in the street, bag of money in the passenger seat. Simcoe's been asking for me on the road from the west to the east. Way up, I might never come down, cause the coast racking up the flight miles. So high, I might never come down, so what, this is my lifestyle.